"Are you deaf, girl?" the judge said. "Hand over the notebook." The crack of the deputy's hand against Vanessa's cheek echoed like a gunshot through the silent courtroom. The gallery gasped. Judge Brian Ellis sneered from his elevated bench, drunk on absolute power. "Take her into custody for contempt," he barked. But the black woman didn't cry. She didn't cower. Instead, she slowly wiped a drop of blood from her lip, her eyes locking onto the corrupt judge with terrifying calm. "No," she whispered. "You step down. You're sitting in my seat." The air inside Courtroom 302 of the Cook County Circuit Court always smelled faintly of floor wax, stale sweat, and quiet despair. It was a cavernous room built in the early 1960s with heavy oak paneling and brutalist concrete accents that seemed designed to make anyone standing before the bench feel incredibly small. For the past 12 years, this room had been the personal thief of Judge Brian Ellis. Sitting in the third row of the public gallery, Vanessa Cole blended perfectly into the background of exhausted public defenders, anxious family members, and bored paralegals. She wore a modest tailored charcoal blazer over a simple white blouse. Her natural hair pulled back into a neat professional style. She wore no flashy jewelry, carried no designer handbag, just a standard legal-ruled moleskin notebook resting on her crossed knees. To the casual observer, she was just another law student or a concerned relative waiting for a docket call. In reality, Vanessa Cole was a Georgetown University Law Center graduate, a former federal prosecutor who had built a terrifying reputation for dismantling organized crime syndicates, and as of 48 hours ago, the newly appointed chief administrative judge for the entire judicial district. She had been sent here incognito by the state's Judicial Inquiry Board. For months, complaints had been pouring in regarding Judge Ellis. The accusations painted a picture of a tyrant, a man who regularly handed down draconian maximum sentences to minorities, openly mocked public defenders, and seemed remarkably lenient toward landlords, corporate defendants, and the wealthy. The state Supreme Court had quietly initiated a review under the Judicial Conduct and Disability Act of 1980, and Vanessa was their designated sword. She wasn't just here to observe. She possessed the extraordinary emergency executive authority to suspend any sitting judge in the district if she witnessed egregious misconduct. Vanessa's pen scratched quietly against the heavy paper of her notebook. She was writing down everything. Up on the bench, Judge Brian Ellis was holding court in a manner that turned Vanessa's stomach. Ellis was a man in his late 50s with a ruddy complexion, a shock of thinning gray hair, and a perpetual sneer that seemed etched into the deep lines of his face. He leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, steepling his fingers as he looked down his nose at the defendant standing before him. The defendant was a young black man, barely 20 years old, wearing an oversized faded dress shirt. He was shaking. His public defender, a tired, ill-looking woman drowning in case files, was trying to speak, but Ellis kept interrupting her. "Counselor, I don't care that your client was late because the public bus broke down." Ellis's voice boomed through the courtroom's microphone, dripping with aristocratic disdain. "Punctuality is a sign of respect, a concept your client clearly struggles with, along with his inability to pay a simple parking fine." "Your Honor," the public defender pleaded, her voice tight. "Mr. Thomas works 2 minimum wage jobs. The fine was $200. He had the money today. The delay was entirely out of his control. Revoking his probation for a 30-minute transit delay is an extreme measure." "Extreme?" Ellis chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. He leaned forward, eyes locking onto the trembling young man. "I call it a necessary lesson in personal responsibility. We don't coddle rule breakers in my courtroom." Probation revoked. 30 days in county jail. A soft, choked sob escaped from an older woman sitting 2 rows ahead of Vanessa, the boy's mother. The young man dropped his head, tears hitting the scuffed wooden table. Vanessa's pen dug hard into the paper. Bias evident. Disproportionate sentencing, clear violation of judicial temperament guidelines. The ink flowed as she documented the exact timestamp, the case number, and the precise words Ellis used. She was so focused on her meticulous documentation that she didn't notice the heavy, aggressive footsteps approaching the gallery aisle until a shadow fell across her notebook. It was Deputy Craig Jenkins, Ellis's head bailiff. Jenkins was a massive, thick-necked man who wore his tactical vest so tightly it looked like a corset. He had a reputation for roughing up defendants in the holding cells, a rumor Vanessa was well aware of. "Hey," Jenkins growled, his voice a low rumble meant to intimidate. "No recording devices, no cell phones, and no note-taking in the gallery unless you're credentialed press. Hand over the book." Vanessa looked up slowly, her expression placid. "I am not recording, Deputy. I am taking handwritten notes. The courtroom is a public forum, and I am entirely within my First Amendment rights to observe and write." Jenkins's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being told, clear his throat, no, especially not by a black woman sitting quietly in his gallery. "I don't care what you think your rights are," I said. "Hand it over, or I'm throwing you out." The confrontation was low, but in the echoing silence following the young man's harsh sentencing, the murmuring caught the attention of the bench. Judge Ellis tapped his gavel lightly. "Deputy Jenkins, is there a problem in my gallery?" Jenkins puffed out his chest, turning slightly toward the bench. "Got a spectator here refusing to follow courtroom decorum, Your Honor." Taking extensive notes, refusing to hand them over, Ellis's eyes shifted, locking onto Vanessa. A smirk played at the corner of his mouth. "Well, we can't have that. Bring her forward, Deputy. Let's see what's so important." Vanessa closed her notebook with a soft, decisive snap. The trap was set. Now she just had to let them walk into it. "You heard the judge," Deputy Jenkins snarled, reaching down to grab Vanessa by the upper arm. Vanessa smoothly shifted her weight, slipping out of his grasp before his thick fingers could clamp down on her sleeve. She stood up under her own power. She smoothed the front of her blazer, her face an unreadable mask of absolute composure. "Do not touch me, Deputy," she said, her voice carrying a quiet, resonant authority that made a few lawyers in the front row turn around in surprise. Jenkins flushed, his face turning a mottled red. He hated being undermined, and he hated that she wasn't showing an ounce of fear. "Walk," he barked, gesturing toward the wooden gate that separated the public gallery from the well of the court. Vanessa walked down the aisle, her posture impeccably straight, her heels clicking softly against the floor. She approached the podium, usually reserved for defense attorneys and prosecutors. Stopping precisely behind the microphone, she looked up at Judge Brian Ellis. Ellis peered down at her over his reading glasses, looking at her as if she were a piece of dirt someone had tracked onto his expensive carpet. "Name?" he demanded. "My name is not relevant to the fact that your bailiff is attempting to seize private property without a warrant, probable cause, or lawful authority, Your Honor," Vanessa replied. Her voice didn't shake. It was perfectly modulated. The voice of a woman who had spent a decade dissecting hostile witnesses on the stand. A heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the courtroom. The public defender at the neighboring table stared at Vanessa with a mixture of horror and awe. No one spoke to Judge Ellis like that. Absolutely no one. Ellis's face darkened. The smug smirk vanished, replaced by a deep, ugly scowl. "Excuse me. You march into my courtroom, disrupt my proceedings, and then presume to lecture me on the law. I am not lecturing, Your Honor. I am stating a factual reality," Vanessa said, holding his gaze. "The Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld the right of the public to observe and take notes in open court proceedings. I have caused no disruption. The disruption was caused by your deputy contempt." Ellis hissed, leaning over the mahogany bench. "I am holding you in direct criminal contempt of court. Jenkins, take the notebook, confiscate it as evidence, and put her in handcuffs. She can spend the weekend in a holding cell and see if she remembers her manners by Monday morning." Jenkins practically vibrated with excitement. This was the part of his job he loved. He stepped up right behind Vanessa. "Give me the book," he demanded, reaching over her shoulder to snatch it from her hands. Vanessa pulled the notebook to her chest and turned sharply to face the deputy. "I am advising you, Deputy, under penalty of federal law, to step back. If you lay a hand on me, you will be committing assault." Jenkins laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Assault in here. I am the law in here, sweetheart." He lunged for the notebook. Vanessa sidestepped, moving with a fluid grace that threw Jenkins off balance. He stumbled slightly, his heavy tactical boots squeaking loudly against the floorboards. Humiliated in front of his judge and a courtroom full of lawyers, Jenkins lost whatever thin shred of professional restraint he possessed. He didn't reach for the notebook this time. He reached for her. Jenkins swung his thick, heavy hand in a wide arc. It wasn't a tactical maneuver. It was an act of pure ego-driven rage. The slap connected with the left side of Vanessa's face. Crack. The sound was horrifyingly loud. It echoed off the concrete walls and the high ceiling. The physical force of the blow snapped Vanessa's head to the side. Her vision swam for a fraction of a second, a burst of white-hot pain exploding across her cheek and jaw. She staggered half a step back, her heel catching slightly on the edge of the carpet, but she did not fall. She maintained her grip on her notebook. Pandemonium erupted. The young mother in the gallery screamed. Several lawyers jumped to their feet. The court reporter gasped, her hands flying off her steno machine. "That's enough," Ellis roared from the bench. But he wasn't reprimanding his officer. He was yelling at the gallery. "Order. Order in my court, or I'll have the whole room cleared." He looked down at Vanessa, a vicious, satisfied gleam in his eye. "Take her into custody now." Jenkins reached for his heavy metal handcuffs, a triumphant sneer on his face. "Hands behind your back." Vanessa slowly turned her head back to center. Her cheek was already swelling, a stark, angry red mark forming against her dark skin. A tiny trickle of blood pulled at the corner of her mouth where her teeth had caught her inner lip. She didn't raise her hand to touch the wound. She didn't cry out. She looked Jenkins dead in the eye, and the raw, unadulterated power in her gaze made the massive deputy freeze in his tracks. He hesitated, the handcuffs dangling uselessly from his fingers. Then Vanessa looked up at Judge Ellis. "You just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life," she whispered. The microphone caught her words, projecting them in a terrifyingly calm whisper across the frozen room. Judge Ellis scoffed, though an imperceptible flicker of unease crossed his eyes. "Cuff her," he repeated, though his voice lacked its previous thunder. Jenkins stepped forward again, reaching for Vanessa's wrist. "Stop." The word wasn't yelled, but it cut through the room with the force of a physical blow. Vanessa reached inside the breast pocket of her charcoal blazer. Jenkins instinctively stepped back, his hand dropping to the holster of his service weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he shouted. Vanessa ignored him. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and totally devoid of panic. From her inner pocket, she withdrew a heavy navy blue leather wallet. She flipped it open and slammed it down onto the wooden podium with a resounding thud. The golden enameled seal of the state Supreme Court glinted under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Below it was a platinum badge and an intricately embossed identification card. "My name is the Honorable Vanessa Cole," she said, her voice rising in volume, filling every corner of the silent room. "I am the newly appointed Chief Administrative Judge of the Third Judicial Circuit. I was appointed by the governor and confirmed by the state Senate to oversee the conduct, operations, and integrity of this courthouse. And as of this exact second, Judge Ellis, you are relieved of your duties." The color drained from Brian Ellis's face with terrifying speed. He looked like a man who had just been informed that the airplane he was flying on had lost its engines. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Jenkins stared at the gold seal on the podium, his brain struggling to process the information. He looked from the badge to Vanessa, then up to the judge, his aggressive posture collapsing into sudden sheer terror. He had just assaulted the chief administrative judge in open court. "On the record, you," Ellis finally stammered, his aristocratic sneer replaced by a desperate, frantic look. "This is a trick. This is some kind of stunt. I am an elected official. You cannot simply walk in here, and I can and I have." Vanessa cut him off, her voice cracking like a whip. She opened her notebook, the same notebook Jenkins had tried to steal, and ripped out a folded piece of heavy stock paper. She unfolded it and held it up. "This is an emergency order signed by the Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court invoking the Judicial Conduct and Disability Act of 1980. It grants me full unilateral authority to suspend any sitting magistrate in this district pending a full review of extreme misconduct. I came here today to see if the rumors about Courtroom 302 were true. I expected bias. I expected cruelty." Vanessa wiped the blood from her lip with her thumb, holding it up so the red stain was visible. "I did not expect a judge to order an armed deputy to physically assault a peaceful observer. You are out of control, Mr. Ellis, and your reign ends today." "This is outrageous," Ellis screamed, slamming his hands down on his desk. He looked frantically at the other two bailiffs standing near the doors. "Arrest her. I am ordering you to arrest this impostor." The other deputies didn't move a muscle. They were staring at Vanessa's badge. They knew the seal. They knew exactly what it meant. Deputy Jenkins, Vanessa said, turning her icy gaze to the man who had struck her. Jenkins flinched, physically stepping backward. You are hereby stripped of your courtroom authority. Place your service weapon and your badge on the defense table. Now I was just following his orders, Jenkins stammered, his voice cracking. The massive, intimidating brute had vanished, replaced by a terrified man realizing his career and his freedom were evaporating. Following an illegal order to assault a civilian is not a defense deputy. It is a crime, Vanessa stated, her tone surgical and merciless. Gun, badge, table. Now, trembling, Jenkins unclipped his radio, unpinned his star, and carefully drew his firearm, placing them all on the wooden table. He stepped away, raising his hands slightly as if surrendering. Vanessa turned her attention back to the bench. Step down, Mr. Ellis. Ellis was hyperventilating, his hands gripping the edges of the mahogany desk so tightly his knuckles were white. You can't do this to me. I built this courthouse. I have friends in the appellate court. I know the mayor. Then you can call them from your lawyer's office, Vanessa said. But right now, you are going to vacate that chair. If you do not walk down those stairs under your own power, I will have the remaining deputies remove you in handcuffs. Choose for a long, agonizing minute. Judge Brian Ellis did not move. He stared down at Vanessa Cole, the reality of his total destruction crashing over him in waves. The courtroom held its collective breath. The young public defender in the front row had covered her mouth with her hands, tears of sheer shock welling in her eyes. Finally, the fight drained out of Ellis. He looked small. Suddenly, an old bitter man stripped of the armor of his office. He stood up slowly, his hands shaking as he unzipped his black judicial robe. He let it fall over the back of the heavy leather chair, a symbolic surrender. Without saying another word, he walked down the side steps of the bench, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room, and pushed his way through the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. Vanessa watched him go. Then she picked up her notebook, her credentials, and her pen. Her heels clicked against the ancient mahogany floorboards, a rhythmic, deliberate cadence that seemed to measure the final seconds of Judge Ellis's regime. The distance from the gallery to the bench was exactly 32 feet, a path usually walked by the condemned, the desperate, and the terrified. Today it was the path of justice. She walked past the defense table, past the trembling Deputy Jenkins, and approached the side stairs. She walked up step by step and entered the elevated platform of the bench. She stood behind the desk. She didn't put on Ellis's discarded robe. She didn't need it. She reached out and pulled the heavy leather chair forward, sitting down firmly. The view from up here was vastly different. She could see the entire gallery, every face staring up at her in stunned silence. She could see the young black man still standing at the defense table, his face stained with tears, looking at her as if she were an angel sent from heaven. Vanessa reached for the microphone and pulled it close. Madam, court reporter, Vanessa said, her voice echoing with a new localized authority. Please strike the last 30 minutes of proceedings from the official record, noting a procedural reset under the authority of the chief administrative judge. Yes, Your Honor, the court reporter stammered, her fingers flying over the keys. Vanessa looked down at the young defendant. Mr. Thomas, please approach the podium. The young man walked forward on shaky legs, his public defender right beside him. Mr. Thomas, Vanessa said gently, the icy edge gone from her voice, replaced by a firm but deeply humane tone. A courtroom is a place of law, but it must also be a place of justice. Revoking a man's freedom because a public transit system failed him is not justice. It is cruelty disguised as order. She opened the case file sitting on the desk. She scanned the documents quickly. I see here that you have successfully completed 11 months of a 12-month probation. You have passed every drug screen. You maintain 2 jobs to support your mother. Is this correct? Yes, ma'am. Your Honor, the young man whispered. The missed check-in today is hereby excused, Vanessa declared, her pen moving swiftly across the paperwork, crossing out Ellis's signature and applying her own. Clears throat. Furthermore, given your exemplary record over the past 11 months and the undue distress caused to you in this courtroom today, I am retroactively terminating your probation early. Case dismissed. You are a free man, Mr. Thomas. Go back to your jobs. Take care of your mother. A loud sob echoed from the gallery. The young man's mother collapsed into the arms of the woman sitting next to her, weeping uncontrollably. The young man looked up at Vanessa, his chest heaving. Thank you, Your Honor. You are free to go, Vanessa said softly, as the young man and his mother rushed out of the courtroom. Embracing in the aisle, Vanessa turned her attention to the rest of the room. She looked at the remaining baifs. Take Mr. Jenkins into custody, Vanessa ordered. Process him for assault, battery under color of authority, and obstruction of justice. Place him in the holding cells downstairs. Not the administrative offices, the holding cells. Jenkins didn't fight as his former colleagues stepped forward, gently but firmly clicking his own handcuffs onto his wrists. He looked defeated. A bully whose bluff had finally been called. As they led him away, Vanessa picked up the gavel. We are going to take a 15-minute recess, she announced to the stunned gallery. When we return, I will begin hearing the rest of today's docket. And let it be known the era of intimidation in this courthouse is over. She struck the gavel. Bang. Chapter 5. The Excavation of Sins. Taking the bench was only the beginning. The real work, the hard karma, started when the court recessed for the evening. Vanessa moved into Judge Ellis's private chambers behind the courtroom. It was a lavishly decorated office filled with expensive cigars, antique law books that looked like they had never been read, and framed photos of Ellis shaking hands with various powerful politicians. The air in the room was stale, thick with arrogance. Vanessa didn't sit in his plush armchair. She pulled up a stiff wooden chair to the secondary desk, opened her laptop, and began the audit. As chief administrative judge, she had unfettered access to the district's digital archives. She started pulling every case file, every sentencing mandate, and every financial disclosure Judge Brian Ellis had filed over the last decade. She knew that men who abused their power in public were almost always hiding something much darker in private. It took her 3 days of sleepless nights living on black coffee and sheer determination to find, clear's throat, the thread. And once she pulled it, Ellis's entire corrupt tapestry unraveled. The pattern was undeniable. Vanessa cross-referenced Ellis's sentencing records with property deeds and corporate registries. She discovered a glaring anomaly in his eviction and housing court rulings. Whenever a tenant faced eviction from properties owned by a shell company called Oakage Holdings, Ellis ruled in favor of the landlord 98% of the time, often denying tenants their legal right to present a defense. He would order immediate evictions, levying massive fines on the displaced families. Vanessa dug into Oakage Holdings. It took a forensic accountant she brought in from the state capital less than 12 hours to pierce the corporate veil. Oakage Holdings was a subsidiary of a massive real estate trust. And sitting on the board of that trust, receiving exorbitant consulting fees buried under layers of LLCs, was Brian Ellis's brother-in-law. Ellis was systematically displacing poor minority families to clear the way for luxury apartment developers, and his family was reaping massive financial kickbacks for his judicial butchery. But Vanessa didn't stop there. She audited Deputy Craig Jenkins. She pulled his internal affairs file, a document that had miraculously been buried in the basement archives. Jenkins had 17 separate complaints of excessive force filed against him by inmates and defendants over a 5-year period. 14 of those complaints had been dismissed without investigation by none other than Judge Brian Ellis, who had signed the administrative waivers personally. They were a team. Ellis provided the legal cover, and Jenkins acted as his personal enforcer, terrifying the local population into absolute submission. Not anymore. Vanessa whispered to the empty office, her face still slightly tender, where the bruise had blossomed into a dark, angry purple over her cheekbone. She didn't use makeup to cover it up. She wore it like a badge of honor. It was the physical evidence of their hubris. She compiled the dossier, hundreds of pages of bank transfers, court transcripts, and forged documents. She didn't just build a case for judicial dismissal. She built a federal RICO case. She contacted her former colleagues at the United States Attorney's Office. When she presented the evidence, the lead federal prosecutor's jaw hit the floor. Vanessa, the prosecutor had said over the secure phone line, this isn't just misconduct. This is a criminal enterprise operating out of a county courthouse. We can indict him on 20 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations. Do it, Vanessa replied. And I want a grand jury convened for Jenkins by Friday. I want them to feel the exact weight of the system they've weaponized against the vulnerable. The walls were rapidly closing in on Brian Ellis, but the arrogant former judge had no idea just how thoroughly he had been dismantled. He was currently sitting in his sprawling suburban home, calling every political favor he had, assuming this was just a temporary suspension. He believed his money and his connections would protect him, just as they always had. He had deeply underestimated Vanessa Cole. He thought she was just a bureaucrat. He didn't realize she was the storm, and she had already surrounded his house. 3 weeks after the slap heard round the courthouse, the State Judicial Disciplinary Board convened in a secure private hearing room in the Capitol. Brian Ellis sat at the defense table, but he looked nothing like the terrifying tyrant who had ruled Courtroom 302. His ruddy complexion had turned pale and sickly. He wore an expensive suit, but it seemed to hang off him as if he had deflated. He sat flanked by 2 high-priced defense attorneys who both looked incredibly nervous. At the opposite table sat Vanessa Cole. She was wearing her black judicial robes now. Her posture was flawless. The bruise on her cheek had faded, leaving only a shadow, but the fire in her eyes burned brighter than ever. The chairman of the disciplinary board, a severe-looking state Supreme Court justice, looked down at the massive stack of binders Vanessa had submitted. "Mr. Ellis," the chairman began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "We have reviewed the evidence submitted by Chief Administrative Judge Cole. We have seen the financial records linking you to Oak Ridge Holdings. We have seen the internal affairs cover UPS regarding Deputy Jenkins. And we have all watched the security footage and heard the audio recording of you ordering an armed deputy to physically assault Judge Cole in open court." Ellis swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Mr. Chairman, there is context missing. I was under immense stress. The woman, Judge Cole, she was disrupting my courtroom. I didn't know who she was. And if she had truly been an ordinary citizen, an innocent observer, would that have made the assault acceptable, Brian?" The chairman asked, his voice dripping with disgust. "Does the law only apply to people with badges and titles?" Ellis opened his mouth to speak, but his lead attorney placed a firm hand on his arm, silencing him. The lawyer knew a lost cause when he saw one. "The decision of this board is unanimous," the chairman declared, slamming a folder shut. "Brian Ellis, you are hereby permanently disbarred from the practice of law in this state. You are stripped of your judicial pension effective immediately." Ellis gasped, a wet, pathetic sound. "My pension? You can't. I served for 30 years. "You served yourself," Vanessa spoke up, her voice cutting through his panic. "You stole years from innocent people. You destroyed families for profit. You used a gavel as a weapon. Losing your pension is the least of your concerns." Just as the chairman struck his gavel to adjourn the disciplinary hearing, the double doors at the back of the room swung open. 2 agents wearing FBI windbreakers walked in, their faces grim. "Brian Ellis," the lead agent said, stepping forward with a pair of steel handcuffs. "You are under arrest for federal racketeering, wire fraud, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Stand up and place your hands behind your back." Ellis began to weep. The arrogant tyrant completely broke down, sobbing as the cold steel clicked around his wrists. He looked back at Vanessa as they marched him toward the door, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. Vanessa didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply watched the system work exactly as it was intended to work. Later that afternoon, Vanessa received a phone call from the district attorney. Deputy Craig Jenkins had accepted a plea deal. Facing 20 years for aggravated assault under color of authority and conspiracy, he had pleaded guilty. He was going to spend the next 8 years in a federal penitentiary, the very place he used to send the people he abused. The karma was absolute. It was swift, hard, and undeniable. Vanessa walked back into courtroom 302 the next morning. The air felt different. The oppressive, stale stench of fear was gone. The gallery was full, but there was a quiet murmur of hope rather than despair. She walked up the 32 wooden steps. She sat in the heavy leather chair. She looked out at the room, smoothed her black robe, and picked up the gavel. "Court is now in session," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Let us begin. If this story of ultimate justice gave you chills, you are not alone. It is a powerful reminder that arrogance and corruption cannot hide forever, and the universe has a spectacular way of delivering hard karma to those who abuse their power. Judge Vanessa Cole's courage proves that true authority doesn't come from a heavy hand, but from a brilliant mind and an unyielding commitment to what is right. She didn't just take his seat, she restored the soul of the courtroom. Did Judge Ellis get exactly what he deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories of instant karma, dramatic twists, and justice finally being served, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a satisfying story today, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible tales. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss out on our next dramatic